Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. And my guest today is Jeffrey Deskovic. He is the executive director of the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation. Jeffrey was wrongfully accused of rape and murder at the age of 16, sent to jail for 16 years, and after 16 years in jail, was exonerated. And he started the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation. He's here not only to share his story, but his perspective and what changes need to occur in our system. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And this first part, I do want to get your story because I think it's important for people to get the humanity, not just the ideas.
Of course.
Yeah. So at age 16, you were living where?
In Peekskill,
Okay.
New York.
So according to everything I read and saw, you were kind of this quiet kid, and very often quiet kids get mislabeled as weird. And some girl who was, very protected by her family. She was from Colombia, so she didn't, go anywhere alone. Whatever, she went out to do a homework assignment and was found dead and strangled and raped. Yes?
Yes.
So now, tell us some of the sequence of events that had you end up being accused and then found guilty.
Yeah, well, the police interviewed many students from the high school, and some of those students told the police that they might want to speak to me because I seemed strange for them, for the reasons you just mentioned. So that's what the police said initially attracted them to me. The other factor which they said attracted them to me, they said I was overly upset at the victim having been murdered, which I was upset, but this really shook up the whole city. There hadn't been a murder there for about 20 years. So the public officials in the city of Peekskill had even offered free mental health services to anyone who wanted them. So everybody was kind of shook up.
So they understood that this was a huge impact.
Absolutely.
But somehow you seemed a little too upset.
Yes, exactly. So over the next 6 weeks from there, the police, they played this game with me in which they would periodically have contact with me, and my interactions with them would always take on the following dynamic. Half the time they would speak to me as if I was a suspect, and the other half the time they would pretend like they needed my help to solve the crime. Look, the kids won't talk freely around us, they will around you. Let us know if you hear any rumors, stop in from time to time.
So in this kind of double message,
Yes.
What are you feeling? Are you feeling a little apprehensive, or are you actually just thinking they're good guys?
Both. So I mean, when they would talk to me as if I was a suspect, I mean, I would start to feel, nervous. I would start to get apprehensive, and I think they were able to pick up on when they had went a little bit too far, and that's when they would switch to the other theme and, reel me back in, and of course, pretending like they were my friend in addition to this helper. Most people, including myself, when we're really young, we think about what we might want to be when we grow up. And so for me, I had thought at a young age, I had thought I wanted to be a police officer. So I think here, this unexpected opportunity to be involved in police work in some fashion, I think that's kind of what made what now clear as an adult was, absurd proposition. I think that was part of the psychological dynamic of why I stayed involved with them, so to speak.
Right.
So eventually,
Now, as they're talking to you, are they coming to your home? Is your mother aware of this, or where are they talking to you?
At the police station, and at times at different parts in the city. My mother was not aware of my interacting with them. She was aware that I had contact with them once, and she had told me that she didn't want me to interact with them. But then, they're pretending to, they need my help and all this stuff, and just the respect and trust you have for police officers. So, I continue to do so.
And they made you special.
And they made me special. Yeah, and I think to throw in an additional psychological dynamic, I mean, I really grew up without a father figure, and so one of the police officers who was pretending to be my friend, he kind of took on a quasi-father role, and so that was another thing which kind of kept me hooked in there.
Yeah. So they're asking you these questions, and it's kind of, feeling good, not feeling good. And then when did it turn?
Sure. Well, periodically during all these encounters, they would ask me to take a lie detector test, and I would decline to take it. And so finally, eventually, they came up with this plan where They told me, look, we have some new information which has just come into us, but we can't share it with you until you've taken the polygraph. So you have to be, cleared, so kind of a help us to help you to help us, pretzel logic. And so I agreed to take this polygraph test. So so the next day I went, rather than go to school, I went to the police station. Which, since it was a school day, neither my mother nor my grandmother with whom I lived realized that anything was wrong, so they didn't call around looking for me. They drove me to the town of Brewster, which is in Putnam County. So the reason why that's important is because that meant I was no longer able to leave on my own. I was instead dependent upon the police.
Right.
Now, although they had 3 police officers there who I knew were police officers, there was a 4th police officer who was a polygraphist, who was dressed as a civilian and who was pretending not to be a police officer.
So you're supposed to have, a polygraph operator is supposed to be a civilian and not have a vested interest in the outcome, yes?
Yeah, in an objective test, yes, that's
Right.
correct.
So they didn't tell you this, that he's really a policeman dressed as a civilian.
Right, exactly right. So they put me in a small room, and I didn't have an attorney present, and they didn't give me anything to eat the entire time I was there. Before beginning the test, the polygraphist, he gave me countless cups of coffee, and that's important because the premise of the polygraph is if you tell a lie, you'll become nervous, and the nervousness will result in sped up pulse rate. It's actually the pulse rate, which is measured by the machine. But other factors which will result in increased pulse rate would be fear and caffeine. So,
Which you had both.
which I had both. So he used a lot of scare tactics. He invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again, becoming more and more ferocious as time went on. At the same time, they were playing good cop, bad cop in terms of the police officers there who I knew were police officers. Towards the end of and he kept us up for more than 6.5 hours. Towards the end of the interrogation, the polygraphist, he made a statement to me. He said, what do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the test result that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm this. So that really shot my fear through the roof. And it was at that moment that the police officer who was pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and informed me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he was holding them off but couldn't do so indefinitely.
I want to stop you here because this is so horrifying. This is like something out of a movie.
Right.
But it wasn't a movie. It was a 16-year-old boy.
Yes.
Who had been lied to, manipulated, maneuvered, threatened. And what did you think when he said to you, the polygraph told me you were guilty?
That made me very much more fearful. I mean,
Did you think
I didn't doubt my innocence, if that's what you're really
Right,
getting at. No,
right.
I didn't doubt my innocence.
But you're thinking, gosh, the machine is telling them something that isn't true, but that means they could find me guilty. Kind of. I'm sure you're not thinking of that in the moment. So now this other cop who's kind of the father figure is saying to you, I'm holding them off, but they're chomping at the bit to come after you.
Right, and I can't do so, and I can't continue to do this. Look, just do what they want, and you to say what which is to confess, and not only they stop what they're doing, but that you could go home afterwards. Being young, naive, frightened, again, 16, not thinking long term. I'm only concerned with my safety in the moment. Yes, I took the out which they offered. I made up a story based on information which they had given me in the course of their interrogation. By the time the interrogation was finished, by the cop's own testimony, I was on the ground in the fetal position. I was crying uncontrollably.
So again, we think, we don't know what 6.5 hours of badgering are. You're alone, you're isolated. Mm-hmm. These are grown-ups in the adult world who have the power over your life and your safety. And you fed them information, and from what I understand...
Well, they gave me information.
Right, you gave them the information. You regurgitated it, but some of it was wrong.
Right, which shows you that it was a false confession, because if I was the actual perpetrator, I wouldn't have gotten any of the details wrong.
Yeah. And I'm going to interject something here and then go back to the story. I read somewhere that 25% of...
the DNA-proven wrongful convictions were caused by false confessions. Yes, and although adults have been known to give false confessions, particularly vulnerable populations, have been identified by false confession experts as youth and people with mental health issues, in which I was a youth.
Yeah. Okay, so now you're lying on the floor crying in the fetal position. All you wanted to do was get home. Just get home, get home. That's all you heard. And so you're going to do whatever you could. And of course, they're not sending you home.
No.
What happens next?
They brought me back to the Peekskill headquarters. And, it was only it was only later on in the headquarters when they gave me pizza at the police station, and it was only in the course of them doing the processing that it was at that point that I realized that I was in fact under arrest and that the promise they gave me was false. I mean, I didn't even realize that on the way to the police station. So before I went to trial, the results of a DNA test came in from the FBI lab, which showed the semen found in the victim didn't match, which really, by everything right, should have ended the case right there, except that prosecutorial misconduct then took place and aided by fraud by the medical examiner.
So again, they've forced this kind of, intimidated a confession out of you.
Mm-hmm.
DNA evidence shows not yours, but because they've gotten this confession out of you, they run with that.
Yeah, exactly right. And I just want to throw in, Natasha, that the lieutenant of Peekskill who had wrote the letter to the FBI lab urging them to expedite the testing of the DNA wrote in his letter that the test results would either show that I was guilty or else exonerate me. But then when the results came back and it didn't match me, yet, as you said, they ran with it, which is to me, one of the strongest facts for proving that this was not a good faith error.
Right. They had someone.
Right.
You were it.
Right. So when an autopsy is done, the results, the audio and written notes are taken contemporaneously as findings are made as a way of ensuring their authenticity. So it was only 6 months after doing the initial autopsy and only in response to the DNA not matching me that suddenly, for the first time, the medical examiner claimed that he found evidence to show that the victim, who was, as you mentioned, a 15-year-old immigrant from Colombia living a very sheltered life, that she had been, sexually active, which is what opened the door for the prosecutor to argue that it didn't matter that the semen didn't come from me because she could have had sex close enough to a murder, rape, so as to explain away the DNA.
Right. She had had consensual sex before you presumably raped her.
Yes, and taking it a step further, they also named another youth by name that they claimed that she had had this encounter with, but they never did a DNA test to try to prove that. They didn't even call him as a witness. The prosecutor just made the unsupported argument to the jury.
See, the thing that is so horrifying to me is that you can make all those kind of unsupported statements, and from what I gather, you had a public defender.
Yes.
And his investment in you was not a great investment. And so he could have challenged all of this along the way.
Right.
And he never did.
Right. Let me illustrate the ways in which he failed me. Firstly, he never explained to the jury what the significance of the DNA excluding me was, nor used that to argue that this so-called confession was coerced and false, which you would think that's bare minimum. When it was time to cross-examine the medical examiner, whose fraud was so crucial in this case, he never asked him a single question, so we didn't cross-examine him. Because of a conflict of interest, in that my lawyer should have never represented me because the other youth that the prosecution was falsely claiming had this encounter was represented not only by another member of Legal Aid Society of Westchester, but by the attorney who was supposed to be supervising him on my case.
Okay.
And then, in addition to that, as if that wasn't enough, he never spoke to nor called as a witness my alibi. I was actually playing wiffle ball at the time that the crime happened.
So let me stop here because all of this is like mind-boggling. And it just occurs to me like he's just processing a piece of equipment and you happen to be the piece of equipment. And let's just get him through as quickly as possible and get him to the end, wherever that end is. Which the legal system is saying jail. Did you know that he was not a good advocate for you? Were there
No, because I was by that point I was 17 years old. His reputation in Westchester was that he was the best trial lawyer of legal aid, and whenever I would ask him questions whenever I would question him, basically his response was, look, I'm an experienced lawyer, just sit back, relax, let me do my job.
Trust me.
Trust me. And I didn't know any better.
Of course not. I know even as an adult, when I first went looking for a divorce lawyer, it's like, trust me. And again, that doesn't always go well. Sometimes
No.
and at 17, my God, how do you know anything different?
Right, exactly. And just to add a few other failings of his, he very rarely met with me. And then whenever we would meet, I would try to explain to him that I was innocent and what happened in the interrogation room, but he was always shutting me up. I remember on one particular memorable occasion, he told me he didn't care whether I was guilty or innocent, which is kind of mind-boggling in of itself, because you would think that that would affect the strategy and how you present and see a case.
Right, and you had evidence. You had
The DNA test.
a DNA test, an alibi, the coercion of the confession, and he was not interested in any of that.
No. Then I wanted to testify at the pretrial hearing because although testifying truthfully to the circumstances of the interrogation in the main, the cops conveniently left out the illegal things which they did, which was the threat and the false promise. So my testimony would have been the only way that evidence could have made its way onto the record. So I wanted to testify at the pretrial hearing, but he wouldn't allow me to. He said, look, I haven't decided if you're going to testify at the trial or not, so I don't want to have you under oath as to what happened. But that doesn't make any sense, because had the judge believed me, then the confession would not have been allowed as evidence and there would have been no trial. Then when we got to the trial, he wouldn't allow me to testify there either, telling me, well, it's not my job to prove you're innocent. They have to prove you're guilty, and I don't think they've done that. So that's really a maxim you might hear in a classroom that's naive to think it works that way. In reality, if you find yourself charged with a crime you're innocent of, you better do everything in your power to prove that you're innocent, or else you run a risk of possibly being wrongfully convicted.
Yeah, and the thing that, it's so horrifying, but the thing that is mind-boggling is that so many steps along the way, people...
It was a total systems failure.
Yeah. Failed you every step along the way.
Yes.
And at 17, did it feel to you like you were living in somebody else's nightmare?
Yes, it did.
So now you go to trial, and they find you guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And the minute that they say guilty...
I felt like it was surreal, like I was, as you said, I was in this nightmarish alternative reality, because my way of thinking, at least up until that point in time, was that only the guilty were convicted. And then to add to the system's failure aspect of it, on the day of the sentencing, I begged the judge to overturn the verdict, and I referenced the DNA to support my contention. He actually told me on the record, maybe you are innocent, conceding that there's a doubt, but that didn't lead him to step up for justice and exercise his discretion by overturning the conviction. He instead did the easy, politically expedient thing, which was to sentence me to a term of imprisonment of 15 to life.
And I heard that the fact that it's 15 to life means that there's no end date by when they have to release you.
Exactly right.
It's like this endless sentence.
Right, exactly right.
You could, after 15 years, go in front of a parole board, but there was no compelling reason for them to ever release you.
Right, they would never reach a point in time where they were legally obligated to release me. It was totally discretionary. And as it turned out, after I did the 15 years, I was turned down for parole, resulting in my doing an additional year before I was proven innocent.
In our conversation before the show, one of the things that I mentioned that I want to mention on the show is this can happen to anyone. Does it happen every day? No, but it happens. And it doesn't happen just to people in certain neighborhoods or whatever. It can happen to anyone. And we need to pay attention.
I want to reinforce your point. I agree with you. As of now, there's been 332 DNA-proven wrongful convictions across the country, about 1,400 non-DNA cases, and still counting. There is no particular life path that you could be on in order to exempt you from this. Last year, according to a New York Times study, there was 87 people exonerated, and then another 2 were found after that. And this year, we're up to about 60. As a matter of fact, there's an organization that I'm a coalition. I'm an advisory board member, and my foundation is part of the coalition. It's actually called "It Can Happen to You," and we're working on a couple of really important innocence reforms, such as automatic discovery, which means all the evidence should be turned over at the time a person is arraigned. Both information.
And that's not the case now, or is it
No.
state by state?
It's state by state. Most states don't have it. New Jersey actually does have automatic discovery. Most states do not. So
you can hold back evidence forever until just before the trial.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes they go beyond that. Sometimes it doesn't come out until post conviction. So there's that, and then also a commission on prosecutor conduct. There should be an oversight board to discipline rogue prosecutors, and right now there isn't that, and prosecutorial misconduct is a really big factor in most of these cases.
You know, you and I were talking before, and the one thing I said is I keep asking the unanswerable question: why would anybody do something so evil? And I'm sure there are a lot of answers. Each person is different. I think some of it in my mind is it just becomes another day, another person to process through the system, and you know, you develop an attitude toward if they arrested him, he's probably guilty. Does it happen to women?
Absolutely. Yeah, women are wrongfully convicted as well. We know that because some women have been exonerated. There hasn't been a lot of women exonerated, some. And the reason for that is because most of the organizations in the innocence movement only take on cases if there's DNA in it, and that typically is murder and rapes, and you know that those aren't the typical crimes that women are wrongfully convicted of.
So there was a question I wanted to ask you, it slipped my mind, but so now you're convicted and you've got your sentence to 15 years to life, and you walk into this maximum security prison at the age of 17, all adults.
Yes.
And in one interview you said you see these guys with arms as big as your thighs.
Yes.
Knowing that sexual offenders are considered the low end of the pond.
Yes.
And are not treated well.
Yes.
What is your feeling in that moment?
I was living in fear that that the crime I'd been wrongfully convicted of would come out.
Did it?
Yes, at times it did. Yeah, one time I almost lost my life.
So you're living, and see, the thing is that also, this was the thought I lost, is the idea that while you're in prison, the actual guilty person is out there and kills someone else.
Yes, 3.5 years later, the actual perpetrator killed someone else in Peekskill who was a teacher and a mother of 2.
So not only did they take away your life and your extended family, some aspect of their life,
Yes.
but they took away just by default this woman's life,
Yes.
a mother of 2 children.
Yes.
And in the end, you got exonerated, but what's happened in between? So now I want to go back to being in prison because I can't imagine, like, it's just so terrifying. So it's like living on the edge moment by moment.
Yes, exactly right.
Forever and ever.
Yes.
So you're constantly alert, on the watch,
Yes.
afraid.
Yes.
How do you avoid not getting attacked, not being the focus of, or do you ever avoid that entirely?
You never avoid it entirely, but you just can do certain things to try to, minimize it.
Like what?
Well, I never talked about my case. So if people ask,
Right.
well, what are you in for? I just say, well, the prison slang is I have a body. I mean, it's a
Right.
way of saying, I'm in for a murder.
Yes.
So there's that aspect of it. I'm minding my business.
Do you have a roommate? Are you alone?
About half the time I had a roommate. The other half the time I did not. So violence was happening in one part of the prison, like if I'm in a recreational area. So you put your back against the wall. If you're seated and you take a seat in the mess hall, so you calculate online which people are going to have their back to the new line of people, and you want to be on the other side of the table so you can see everything, and you have to try to figure out who are the gang members, who's in what gang, and try to avoid socializing with them because sooner or later they're going to self-destruct in one way or another, and you don't want to be around them when it happens. Just kind of like be quiet and to yourself.
What is it? You're a different person than you would have been.
Of course.
And what is it that you think, what characteristics that you had as a human being, and maybe there were just some that you had to develop, that had you survive relatively intact physically?
I think my ability to adapt and learn and think quickly on my feet, and I guess as it turns out, just resilience. I just did not give up. I think I mentioned to you earlier that I lost all 7 of my appeals. I was turned down for parole, and I wrote letters for about 4 years without very rarely getting a response in terms of trying to get some legal assistance. And through all that, and then I was turned down for parole. So through all that, I kept plowing through and kept thinking about how am I going to get out of here.
So
and
that was always in the foreground.
Yes.
I'm going to get out of here.
Yes. Yes.
I think that kind of probably looks to me like the only salvation is to continue that. Otherwise, it was like, it would be so hard not to just give up. And
Sure. Well, even with all that, I'll tell you, I mean, thoughts of depression, isolation, helplessness, thinking, suicidal ideation. I mean, even thoughts of giving up. All those were frequently came in my mind, and so I not only waged an external battle, but it also was an internal one as well.
yeah. Just one more question before this first half hour, because we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the legal implications. But when you came out, I think one of the things that was really touching was, you come out and it's first night home and you'd think it's going to be this big, you like, yeehaw, celebrate. And you walk in this room of your family and the feeling is, I don't belong.
Right. By that point, really, they had really become strangers to me. And, to the extent that I did have some limited visitation, I mean, the conversations always centered around how do I get out of here? How do I prove my innocence? So really, there was no real meaningful communication. And as you said, I just felt like I didn't belong, that I was out of place, that they were strangers, and that I didn't really belong in society, because by that point, prison was almost everything that I knew. And so being unable to relate to the people in the house, I went out to the backyard and just sat there. And I had always wanted to stay outside when it was dark out, because in the prison yard, they make you go inside. But the other point of what you're saying is very true, that there was no friends left for me to call, to have a part. Who was I going to call? I had long since lost touch with any of my
And
friends.
it's like all your focus has been to get out, and then not kind of really being fully cognizant, and how could you be, of what that would mean. Like you have this vision of, free at last, but there are other consequences. We're through with our first half hour. I can't wait to do the next half hour. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
My pleasure.
My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.